I have spent hundreds of hours testing and reviewing projectors, and the one thing that most people don't realize is that having the right picture settings is just as important as the quality of the projector. So over the next few months, I'm going to be making a series of videos explaining how to adjust the picture settings on my most recommended projectors, starting today with the Valerion Pro 2. And even before you turn the projector on, you have an important decision to make, because you may know that the Valerion has a 1.6 times optical zoom, meaning it can project a 100-inch screen from anywhere between 80 and 130 inches. But what you might not know is that having the projector close to the screen at its minimum throw ratio will cause the image to be about 7 to 8% brighter. But having the projector further away at its maximum throw ratio results in a significant increase in contrast between 25 and 35%, which is a great trade-off for less than 10% decrease in brightness. So my recommendation is to always use the Valerion Pro 2 at its maximum throw distance if your room allows for it. Next, after you've got the Valerion powered on, but before you start adjusting any picture settings, I would also recommend going to Settings, System, About, and System Update to make sure that you're on the latest firmware from Valerion. And then after you've done that, it's time to start adjusting some picture settings. And the first thing that you need to know is that you're going to have 4 different sets of picture options, depending on whether the content that you're watching is in SDR, HDR, HDR10+, or Dolby Vision. And in order to access those specific settings, you need to be playing that content type. Starting with SDR picture settings, there are 2 different ways to access the settings using the Valerion remote. And the first is by pressing the gear icon, which will bring up the Google TV settings dialog, and from there you can either choose all settings or jump directly into picture options. But my preferred method for accessing the settings is to use the hamburger button on the remote to access the configurable quick access menu. And if you scroll all the way over to the right, you can edit which specific submenus you want to have access to. And I personally choose picture mode, game settings, picture, 3D, and game bar on my quick access menu. Picture mode lets you toggle between different presets, and I personally set up 3 different modes: theater for watching movies and TV shows, sports for sports, and PC/game for video games. But where we're going to spend most of our time is in the picture submenu, where the first option is to select which preset you're modifying, and the second determines whether you're going to modify this preset across all 3 HDMI ports and the native Google TV apps, or whether you just want these picture options to apply to the current HDMI source only. Under General, you've got 3 options for content type auto detection, which will automatically switch the picture mode to things like Filmmaker or IMAX for certain content, and I personally like to leave that off since I don't particularly like Filmmaker mode. Auto picture mode I also leave off, and then there's AI scene, which to be honest, I don't really see any difference whether it's on or off, so I just leave it off. Next, we're going to temporarily skip over the laser luminance menu to go into color. And this is where you'll set your projector's color temperature. And for most people, you're going to want to either choose warm 1 or warm 2, depending on what looks right to you. And from a purely color accuracy standpoint, warm 1 is an almost exactly perfect D65 white point when measured with my $8,000 spectral radiometer. But warm 2 may look more accurate to you if your eyes aren't quite as sensitive to red. The next option in this menu is color space, and 99.9% of the time you'll want to leave this on auto, which will just use whatever color space the content says it should. And forcing a specific color space is very likely to ruin your projector's color accuracy by massively oversaturating the colors. And the last menu option in here is called Dynamic Color Enhancer, which I have also found negatively impacts color accuracy, so I also leave that off. Next, we'll move back up to laser luminance, which has all the most important options. And in this menu, the first option is laser luminance, which controls how bright the projected image is. And I personally like to watch movies in a room with a small amount of ambient bias lighting, and I prefer the brightest possible image. But if you're watching in a completely dark room, or if you're experiencing eye fatigue, you may want to turn down the laser luminance. And I did go ahead and check, and running a lower laser power doesn't seem to affect the native or the dynamic contrast of the Valerion, so feel free to change the setting without any fear of messing up your picture quality. But new in the most recent firmware, setting a laser power lower than 5 will automatically disable the enhanced black level modes, so I would recommend using at least 5 for your laser luminance. And the next option is EBL, which stands for Enhanced Black Level, and that's Valerion's version of laser dimming. And the effectiveness of EBL is basically what sets Valerion apart from every other projector on the market. If you set EBL to high dynamic range, the Valerion is going to attempt to use laser dimming in every single scene, dynamically adjusting laser power to get the deepest black levels possible while maintaining bright highlights. If you set it to dark level enhancement, EBL will only activate during darker scenes, and if you set it to off, the Valerion won't use any laser dimming at all. and you'll be limited to only the native contrast ratio, which is around 1600 to 1. And the upside of EBL is obviously a massively increased contrast ratio up to about 12,000 to 1, but the trade-off is occasional flickering caused by quick laser power adjustments and color shifting, usually towards red, as each individual color diode has to independently adjust. I would personally recommend setting EBL to high dynamic range, but if those trade-offs are too much for you, you should try to set EBL to dark level enhancement, and if you still can't handle the occasional dynamic dimming artifact, the Valerion probably isn't the best projector for you, because turning off EBL basically gets rid of its biggest strength. Next, we're going to temporarily skip over contrast and black level to talk about dark detail, gamma, and active contrast, which all do very similar things. And we'll start with the most broad adjustment, which is gamma. The Valerion lets you set gamma values of 2.0, 2.2, 2.4, and BT1886, and using lower numbers like 2.0 will flatten out the dynamic range, which increases the brightness in dark areas compared to the larger numbers like 2.4, where shadowy areas will appear to be very dark. And there is no right or wrong gamma setting, but in general, if you're watching your projector in a bright room, you should choose 2.0. If you have a small amount of ambient light, then 2.2 should work well. And in a completely blacked out theater room, 2.4 or BT1886 may be viable options. But I personally don't use them since they tend to make it harder to see shadowy details. Dark detail is a sort of intelligent selective gamma adjustment that looks for shadowy areas of the image, and it brightens up any lighter values within that area to provide more contrast and make the details easier to see. And in theory, this is a great option, but depending on the quality of your content, it can also make digital noise and streaming artifacts more visible. Active contrast takes that intelligent selective gamma one step further and applies it to the entire image rather than just the darkest areas. And for every single frame, active contrast will brighten up the highlights and reduce the brightness of the shadows to try to use the entire dynamic range of the projector. And confusingly, the options for this setting are labeled low, medium, and high, but specifically for SDR, low has the largest effect on the image, medium has the least effect, and high is somewhere in the middle. And I personally prefer to have active contrast on medium. And then once you've settled into some combination of gamma, dark detail, and active contrast, you can then go back and adjust your contrast and black levels. And this option called black level has traditionally been called brightness on most other displays, and I'm happy enough about the name change since the setting determines the point where a pixel should be completely black. And setting the black level above 0 will brighten up the shadows but will raise the projector's overall black floor, while setting it to a negative value will make sure that you're getting the darkest possible black levels, but it can result in crushed shadow details if you move it too far down. I personally like to use the warehouse scene in Wakanda Forever for all of my adjustments and make sure that the shadowy details are visible, but that the darkest parts of the scene are as dark as the black bars on the bottom and top of the screen. Next, the contrast setting is basically the opposite of black level, and it can easily be renamed to white level. And it determines the point at which a pixel should be completely white. Setting contrast too high can cause the highlights to get blown out, where areas that are supposed to have detail will appear white instead, and setting it too low can make the entire image look dull and flat. And I like to use this explosion, also from Wakanda Forever, to adjust the contrast to the point where the detail in the flame starts to go away, and then I step it back until that detail reappears. On the internet, you can also find dedicated test patterns for setting the brightness and contrast, but I've personally found that if you're using dynamic options like dark detail and active contrast, you really need to set those values using actual content. The last three options are brightness enhancer, which you should leave off for everything except for maybe 3D content, HDMI dynamic range, which you should always leave on auto, and HDR enhancer, which might be worth it if you've decided to turn active contrast off, but I personally prefer having active contrast on medium rather than using the HDR enhancer. Next, moving on to the clarity menu, sharpness is usually a setting that I recommend keeping as low as possible since it does add artificial white lines around high contrast areas, but the default setting of 7 does appear to add a little bit of additional clarity without being distracting. Smooth gradient prevents color banding in large areas where there's a gradual shift in color by artificially adding greater color depth, and I think that the low setting works surprisingly well without any unwanted consequences. Super resolution is supposed to increase definition, but in my experience it tends to add a lot of unwanted artifacts, so I definitely leave it off. Noise reduction and MPEG noise reduction both try to hide some of the speckling that can be seen in DLP projectors, but both of them have the unwanted side effect of smearing motion in dark scenes, so I'd personally suggest leaving them off. And last, motion enhancement is sometimes called MEMC, true motion, or frame interpolation, but all of them work by generating extra frames in between low frame rate content to make the motion appear smoother. And the issue with that is that the extra frames aren't real, and the image processor is just guessing what's supposed to happen between those 2 points. So sometimes it can generate strange artifacts, and even worse than that, making low frame rate content into high frame rate content causes the soap opera effect, which makes everything look hyper realistic instead of cinematic by hiding motion blur. Thankfully though, the Valerion has a custom motion enhancement setting that lets you individually dial in the 2 different aspects of motion enhancement, which are judder reduction and blur reduction. And despite their name, they seem to actually be reversed in their effect. And increasing judder reduction leads to a greater soap opera effect, and increasing blur reduction is more likely to cause those motion artifacts, especially in moving text and in credits. And for me, the sweet spot is judder reduction 1 and blur reduction 5, but I would recommend increasing judder reduction as far as you can until you start to notice the soap opera effect, and then back it off 1 level. And the last menu here is called calibration settings, and to be honest, I don't think that you should really try to mess with these settings unless you have a colorimeter or a already calibrated reference monitor to compare to, because even small changes here can really mess up your overall color accuracy and even destroy your black levels. So to wrap up SDR picture settings, there are really no wrong settings here, and you should really set up your projector for what looks best for you, but here are my preferred settings for watching movies in SDR using an Apple TV as my source, and here are my settings for watching sports in SDR, with the main difference being the color temperature, which I set to the slightly cooler warm 2 white point, and motion enhancement, which I set up for maximum clarity, since cinematic motion blur isn't something that you want to see in a football game. If you're watching HDR content, all the menus are mostly the same, except for inside of the laser luminance menu, the gamma value is locked at something that's called ST2084, which aims to give the biggest differences between the darkest and brightest areas. But as a result, it can cause moderately lit areas to look a little bit flat. And the most important option for HDR is called dynamic tone mapping, which will map the dynamic range of your content to a level that your projector can actually produce. And you absolutely want to have this option on, otherwise you're going to see massively blown out highlights in every single bright scene. And again, there are really no wrong settings, but this is what I use for watching HDR content. And last, Dolby Vision has all of the same options plus 1 sneaky one. And even though you can see that the gamma is locked at 2.2, if you go into settings, display and sound, screen size, you'll find that adjusting the screen size between 80 and 150 inches is almost exactly like adjusting the gamma in SDR content. And choosing a screen size of 150 inches is very similar to a 2.0 gamma with brighter shadows. 100 inches is more like 2.2 gamma, and 80 inches is more like 2.4 gamma, which will give you the darkest shadowy areas, and that's going to be suitable for a completely light controlled room. And here are my preferred settings for Dolby Vision content. So now that we've covered movies and sports, let's talk about gaming. And as of right now, there are no projectors outside of China that support VRR, and no DLP projectors that support 4K 120 Hz. But the Valerion does support 4K 60, 1080p 120, and 1080p 240 Hz with very low input lag and no motion blur, which makes it an excellent option for competitive gaming. Starting out with 4K 60 Hz gaming like you'd see on the new Nintendo Switch 2 in docked mode, if you just use a standard picture mode like SDR Theater, the input lag is going to be around 138 milliseconds, which is not good. However, just switching the picture mode to PC/game reduces the input lag to 34.3 milliseconds, which is totally usable. And the best thing about this option is that you can still use digital keystone while maintaining that same input lag. However, if you want to reduce that to a near single frame input lag, you need to also go into all settings, projector, and then scroll all the way down to DLP turbo mode, which disables keystone and most advanced image processing in favor of the lowest input lag, and that gets it down to 17.6 milliseconds, which is excellent. If you want to go even lower than that, you'll need to use a higher refresh rate like 1080p 120 Hz, and you can achieve input lag numbers as low as 12.1 milliseconds by activating PC/game mode, DLP turbo mode, and high refresh rate mode, which is found in game settings. And at 1080p 120 Hz, the Valerion can also do 20.5 milliseconds of input lag using keystone by activating PC/game mode and high refresh rate mode without DLP turbo mode. At 1080p 240 Hz, the minimum input lag is 4.6 milliseconds, and turning off DLP turbo mode lets you use digital keystone while still maintaining an impressively low input lag of 8.7 milliseconds. And last, there are a couple more random settings that you probably shouldn't touch. First, in all settings projector, you'll find ultra sharp mode that controls the Valerion's pixel shifting motor, and disabling that setting will cause the Valerion to output its native 1080p, which can be useful for dialing in focus, but not much beyond that, so definitely keep it enabled. And last, I've seen a lot of people suggesting that it's better to leave DLP turbo mode on all the time, but in my experience that tends to increase the DLP rainbow effect, so I would personally recommend leaving it off unless you specifically need the extra gaming performance. And that about covers all the relevant options that you should be changing on your Valerion Pro 2. As firmware updates happen and options change, I will try to update a pinned comment, and if I missed a setting that you're wondering about, make sure to let me know down in the comment section. And if this video was helpful for you, don't forget to hit that thumbs up button and consider subscribing, and as always, thanks for watching The Hookup.